Welcome back. Now, from the first democratic local government elections in 2000, local government elections have produced what is termed hung councils. And a hung council arises when no political party wins more than 50% of the seats in the municipal council, thus making the formation of a coalition or minority government inevitable. However, these coalitions are failing or collapsing, and this is resulting in severe disruption of service delivery. Now, in response to the confusion that has stemmed from coalition governments, the Department of Cooperative Governance and Traditional Affairs is planning a new system of governing coalitions by the next term of local government elections in 2026. The department has stated that local coalition instability can greatly affect the municipality's ability to implement policies and bylaws, make senior management appointments, and of course adopt a budget. So to discuss this matter further, we joined by the Deputy Minister of the Department of Cooperative Governance and Traditional Affairs, Mr. Park Stow. Mr. Stow, thanks for your time. Welcome to Morning Live.
Good morning, and thank you very much.
Now, the first priority for the new leadership in your department, that's the Department of Cooperative Governance and Traditional Affairs, was to bring stability to the chaotic and mostly coalition-led municipalities. How far would you say you've come as far as that's concerned?
I would say that we are particularly concerned about the levels of instability that we are witnessing, that have been exacerbated by the increase in the number of coalition municipalities in the country that currently cover about 30% of the municipalities in the country that are hung councils and therefore require some form of coalition government in one form or another. And what we've witnessed is the levels of instability, the impact this is having on the administration, and by extension, the impact that this is having on service delivery. So we've decided that we need to drive a process of creating stability, not only the next term, but looking at the current term. How do we ensure that current legislation is utilized optimally to ensure that we address the challenges in our municipalities? And this would include amending the establishment notice of local government. So if I may just explain a bit, Section 12 of the Municipal Structures Act provides that the MEC for local government in a province shall issue a notice of establishment of a municipality prior to an election. But at any point, the MEC, in terms of Section 16, can effect amendments to the establishment notice. So we are initiating a process of conversation with the MECs, particularly in those provinces that are negatively affected by the instability, to say, is it not an opportune time to consider amending these notices? Of course, you have to go through a process, but that can create a particular level of stability. And this would create, for example, an environment in which you then create a mayoral collective where parties are represented in proportion to the number of votes that they have received, and therefore you reduce the element of deal making that we have seen that's impacting negatively and essentially facilitating the number of changes that we experience in local government. So I'm just saying that we don't just have to start in driving legislation towards the next local government election, but we also have to stabilize what we currently have.
So, Mr. Stow, you and I both know that the law, if you come up with it, is not necessarily going to be a decisive factor to determine the success or failure of these coalitions. But, you know, what is it that makes you more optimistic that it would, in fact, have a positive impact?
Firstly, because the law would create particular prescriptions and responsibilities for those represented in council. It would possibly create obligations on both provincial and national government to do certain things through which then you can create particular stability. And I'm not going to preempt what the law might or might not say, but in terms of law, you create prescripts that would dictate how all parties should conduct themselves, at what point do you intervene, and if you intervene, what the levels of intervention could be. So that's the first thing. The second is I've been encouraged by the fact that more and more political parties have come up and said we need firm proposals on how to govern coalition governments, and proposals are being brought forward to say these are the possible options for legislating and governing coalition governments. So the conduct of political parties is particularly important in this regard. So the extent to which political parties are starting to take responsibility for ensuring that they contribute towards stability is an encouraging sign, at least for us as a department, because in that way, it is those that are elected into office that would assume the primary responsibility of stability and governance. Of course, the law would complement that.
So we've seen, of course, the ANC and the DA already penning strategies to deal with these failing coalitions. But what would be the ideal scenario in terms of encompassing all parties in order to come up with the rules that would govern these coalitions?
Well, at this point, it's difficult to say. I think different political parties are putting different permutations to coalition governments. Part of what is being argued is, do you need a threshold for representation in both the legislature and council, but also do you need a threshold to be represented in the executive? Is that something that would want to ensure? I think it's something that we should consider. I'm not preempting what we're likely to propose as a department, but it's something to consider. The second is, how do you ensure that political parties assume responsibility through ensuring that the deals that they reach in their coalition discussions are not backroom deals between political parties, but these are commitments by parties to the electorate, and therefore it's done in a transparent way, and we can all hold everybody accountable for what they've said the coalition government will do, and if it fails, there's an objective way in which we can measure them as the electorate. And lastly, I think it would enable everybody to ensure that we take into account the outcome of the election, so to say. So it should not be that you form coalition governments in a manner that undermines the democratic outcome of the election. So what is the role and voice of the larger party in a coalition discussion? Who has the right to form a coalition government? So you'd create a framework that does that. We're looking at international experiences with regards to the establishment of minority governments, the establishment of coalitions, who has the right to form a coalition government. So those would create frameworks and benchmarks against which we would be able to develop a framework for our country.
So what happens in the meantime, Mr. Tau? Because local communities continue to bear the brunt of these unstable coalition politics and, of course, hung councils. So what should ordinary South Africans be doing in the meantime while they wait for politicians to get their acts together?
Well, in the meantime, we have to work within current law. As a department, we've made a very deliberate decision to say that we are going to intervene to ensure that local government stabilizes and functions more optimally, and that we will take the necessary action to ensure that this happens within the framework of current law. So when I'm saying that, I'm talking about both in coalition governments, but also in governments that are not governed through a coalition. We have a responsibility to ensure that local government undertakes its executive obligations, and that the mayor and mayoral executive assume that responsibility of executing in line with their mandate. And in instances where that does not happen, there is an obligation, in the first instance, that provincial government would intervene appropriately. But when provincial government has not intervened, there's an obligation on national government to intervene appropriately. So we can't sit back and say, well, you know, the political parties are unable to create stability, therefore South Africans are at the mercy of the instability that is there in local government. We have an obligation and duty to the country to ensure that we intervene appropriately. And that is what we'll be putting forward to our colleagues in provincial government in terms of the need to ensure that we create stability in the system and that we intervene timelessly. I can say that the Minister and I have been engaged with the department extensively over the past few weeks to ensure that this perspective is ingrained in how we plan and how we execute as a department.
I'm very curious to understand exactly how the department would go about intervening, because, and please correct me if I'm wrong, Mr. Tau, but as far as I understand, there are no rules in the Constitution or in legislation that actually defines the principles, the rules, the procedure, or even the sanctions that have to be applied to political parties that attempt to govern together in these coalitions. So if there are no guidelines in that regard, how then are you going to enforce whatever agreement these coalition parties may come to?
The first principle is to recognize the democratic outcome, the role of elected representatives to execute and undertake the responsibilities of local government. But to the extent that their inability to do that is impacting on service delivery, there's an obligation on government to intervene appropriately. So we don't want to use the law and the stick that's available in the law to intervene. We would want to encourage local government to work within current legislation and execute their executive obligations in terms of provision of services and development in communities. But to the extent that they are unable to, for whatever reason, whether administrative, political, or fiscal, we have a responsibility to intervene. And as I said, we have expressed appetite as a department that we're going to intervene decisively to create stability. But that should not be done, as I said, with the intention of seeking to undermine the democratic outcome. So let me make an example. The law says that the government can intervene and assume responsibility in instances where, and this is an intervention of last instance, I should say, but in instances where a municipality is unable to do certain things, the government can intervene to take over those and ensure that those things are done. The law provides for that. But we don't want that to be the stick that we use. We want to encourage that municipalities govern their affairs, but in instances where they are unable to govern their affairs, we have a responsibility to intervene appropriately.
Well, that means Cogta will be running most of the municipalities, Mr. Tau, because if you talk about service delivery or the lack thereof, unfortunately, most of our municipalities are failing and failing dismally. So, you look at so many things that are happening at this particular level of our government, and the majority of people even watching this right now would ask, so why haven't Cogta interfered sooner before things became as bad as they are now in our municipalities?
And we should guard against a situation where Cogta assumes the responsibility of elected representatives, where these are undertaking their responsibility. So it should be an intervention of last instance, where in fact we do not have a choice but to intervene. So there should be other action undertaken to support local government, to ensure that provinces undertake their responsibilities to both support and intervene where appropriate. And we would come in as an intervention of last instance. So I think that principle is important. The second principle that's important is the recognition of the principles of subsidiarity in our governance system. So the government that is closest to where the activity happens assumes the responsibility for that activity. So in this instance, the law dictates clearly that it is the provincial government in the first instance that provides support and intervenes. And it's only in instances where these do not intervene appropriately where Cogta can come in at a national level. So we would be working very closely with provincial governments, with our counterparts in other departments of government, treasury, water and sanitation, and other departments in government to ensure that those responsibilities that are executed at a local government level, for which these counterpart departments have co-responsibility, that they are also able to support and intervene appropriately. So that's the framework that we've been working on over the past few weeks, and we will be executing quite decisively, but in consultation with our counterparts in provincial government rather, but also with the sister departments.
So you mentioned water and sanitation. Let me give you an example. So just yesterday, the South African Human Rights Commission found that the Tswaing and Ngakamodiri Molemo municipalities in the northwest have actually violated the rights of residents by denying them access to water and sanitation, which of course, as you would know, strips them of their dignity as per our constitution. So what is being done to help those residents by your department and by extension, the other 66 municipalities in South Africa that have been declared dysfunctional, people not receiving basic services?
Firstly, I think the principle of subsidiarity still applies. So there is an obligation in the first instance for provincial governments to intervene. We're currently reviewing all the interventions that are in place by provincial governments. There are a few instances where national government has intervened, and we are currently also reviewing that. In fact, I'm in the Eastern Cape now reviewing one of those instances where national government has intervened. So the reality is we're looking at those and saying, what are the next steps? And those next steps should include mechanisms through which, in instances where local government is not executing and the provinces have not intervened decisively, that we take further action to ensure that that happens.
But when? Where? Because you should have such a long list of names by now, Mr. Tau, because the reality is that many residents and also investors in municipalities have actually lost faith in the ability of local government to meet their needs. And again, we have so many examples that we can quote right off the back. Do you agree that what this does is that it actually points to the absence of consequence management and a lack of a will to turn around the malaise at local government level? Because we can't still today be talking about what will happen. These municipalities have been run into the ground, Mr. Tau.
That's exactly what I'm saying, Sakina. I'm saying that I'm currently intervening in a situation where national government has assumed particular responsibilities. So it's a process that is currently underway. I'm not talking about something that is far-fetched. We are engaging with our provincial counterparts with regards to those municipalities under one form of administration or the other to review the efficacy of that administration and to ensure that intervention is undertaken. But we should always guard against of course, undermining the electoral outcome and the responsibility of those elected in local government, and therefore the duty to hold them accountable as citizens in the first instance, but also for provincial and national government to provide support in terms of Section 154 of the Constitution, but also to intervene where necessary. So it should be that all of us take responsibility, and we as government are saying that certainly we are strengthening the way in which we intervene and support local government so that we stabilize the system and ensure that they are able to deliver the services that they are obliged to.
Again, Mr. Tau, it seems like we keep talking and we keep, going over the same ground. New people come into positions and it's almost as if we start all over again, as if these problems haven't been there. Because this dismal state of South Africa's municipalities, it's been well documented, even by the Auditor General. It's been a big talking point for the longest time. Now, is the national government able to play a significant role to ensure that there are adequate financial and non-financial resources available to these municipalities? Are you able to ensure those targeted interventions that are needed in these municipalities? Because what do we see? Unfunded budgets being passed year after year after year, and then we seem surprised that these municipalities are bankrupt.
The fiscal framework of the country does provide for financial support to local government, including through the equitable share. There is a share of the national fiscus that goes directly to local government, but there are also grants and subsidies that go to local government. Part of what we have observed is that as a result of the instability that we have, amongst others as a result of coalitions, there's been an increased number of municipalities that are underspending on grants. So we need to ensure that these grants are spent and that the money is not sent back to the fiscus. So that's part of the interventions that we're currently undertaking. The second is there is a bigger question about the fiscal sustainability of local government and what needs to be done to ensure that we create greater stability in terms of their share in the national fiscal. It's a conversation that's been ongoing, and the department has said we need clarity working with Treasury as to how finally we're going to resolve the evolving fiscal framework. So let me make an example. The electricity situation is moving more and more people off the grid, particularly those that can afford. The impact on local government is devastating to the extent that we've designed a local government system that generates revenue from municipalities. So they buy and sell less electricity and therefore generates lower surpluses. And that's impacting on their debt on ESCOM and a whole range of things that we have to resolve. So yes, there are issues of governance, stability, but there are also systemic issues, policy issues that we need to address to resolve issues around a revised fiscal framework that creates a local government system that has the capability to execute these duties.
Ms. Patel, we're going to have to leave it there. Thank you so much for your time. Deputy Minister of the Department of Cooperative Governance and Traditional Affairs, Park Stow, speaking to us about the state of coalition governments and, of course, what government intends to do about this.